It's Christopher again, bringing you entitled Karens, who met nature's final managers. From a Karen who laughed at her guide seconds before a kudu ended her argument for good, to a Karen who filmed her own proof of negligence, and a crocodile addressed her complaint. But first, let's open a Karen's already bad chapter of her life, who thought it would be a good idea to make it worse by baby talking to a hippo. It was July 14th, 2014, on the eastern bank of a channel in the Okavango Delta, Botswana, where a woman who had spent 3 years photographing animals she loved put herself in danger because she refused to believe one of them could hurt her. Maricel Kovac was 38, a secondary school science teacher from Ljubljana who had taken wildlife photography seriously, but never enough for a proper living. She was in the middle of a divorce from a man who ran guided hunts in the Slovenian highlands and had, by multiple accounts from mutual friends, spent their final 2 years together, telling her that her sentimentality about animals was embarrassing, and she fought back by cheating with one of his best friends. I mean, someone who hunts animals versus someone who appreciates them. There's a place for each of them, but definitely not in a marriage. The Botswana trip was self-funded on a tight budget, a solo slot booked into a small group safari running out of Maun. She carried a mid-range DSLR and a 400mm lens she had saved 11 months to buy. Her goal for the trip was a usable frame of a hippo surfacing at close range, something she had told another tourist on the first morning she had wanted for years. Hippopotamus are not aquatic animals in any meaningful behavioral sense. They graze on land at night and use water purely as a thermal refuge and territorial base during the day. A large adult bull can reach 7,700 pounds and move through shallow water at close to 19 miles per hour in a short charge. If you're a fan of the channel, you know they are responsible for more human fatalities annually in Africa than any other large land animal. The tour guide, a man named Deo, who had run Delta routes for 9 years, had identified a disturbance pattern in the water approximately 82 feet upstream before the group disembarked. He directed everyone to the raised viewing platform and told them explicitly not to approach the bank edge. He pointed at the surface disturbance and identified it as a submerged pod, at minimum 2 animals. Maricel then told him he was reading it wrong, that the movement was current related, and that his caution was, in her words, the same reflexive overprotection she got from people who had never actually studied these animals. 2 other tourists on the platform heard this exchange, with additional berating from Maricel that they described as demeaning the man's job. One of them later confirmed that Deo repeated the warning a second time and physically stepped in front of her as she moved toward the descent, but she shoved him multiple times and stepped around him. She removed her sandals at the platform edge and walked into the shallows until the water was just below her knees. The ripple pattern she had been photographing was approximately 59 feet out and moving slowly, though small surface ripples and intermittent snorting breaks in the water had been visible closer to the bank moments earlier, according to the other tourists. Deo was shouting hysterically from the platform, and I don't blame him. He was about to watch another entitled tourist become a statistic under his watch. The bull surfaced with a sudden forward surge, 4 feet from her position. It did not breach dramatically. It rose, which is worse, because there was almost no warning displacement before the mass of it was simply there. Maricel took 1 step backward. The animal opened its mouth and drove into her at water level. She went under in under 3 seconds of contact. The surface churned for roughly 40 seconds. Deo fired a handheld flare from the platform as a deterrent, though it had no behavioral effect at that range. The group retreated from the platform edge in disarray, while Deo continued signaling on the satellite radio. In the chaos, a 61-year-old Dutch tourist named Wim Berency tripped on the platform railing during the retreat, struck his head on the corner bracket, and sustained a fatal traumatic head injury, and was later pronounced dead at the ranger station after evacuation. As for Maricel, recovery teams worked the channel for 2 days for her. Partial remains were recovered on the second day. Crocodile activity and water turbidity made full recovery impossible. Her death was ultimately ruled accidental, but I think it's suicidal. She died because she needed to be right in front of a man she decided was beneath her, and the hippo didn't care about her divorce, or her photography, or her grievances. We call it a Karen death. The entitlement, the shoving, the refusal to hear no, but really, it was just a very stupid way to prove a point that only she was still keeping score on. Ready for more? Now what makes the next story worse is that the person she was trying to impress was standing right there watching it happen. It was July 14th, 2018, in a conservancy in Kruger. Somewhere in the Lowveld scrub, a 420-pound male lion was about to teach a Karen a lesson no Instagram caption could capture. Donai Murray was 31 and had spent the better part of 3 years in Johannesburg, building a career that moved fast because she made it. She had pushed for this trip, a guided night safari in the greater Kruger area, as a birthday trip for herself, according to her coworkers who listened to her talk nonstop about it. She had booked a premium vehicle with a private guide because, according to her, apparently, half measures were not something she did. Her husband Liam had followed her lead on most of the planning. People who knew them said that was generally how things went. I think she genuinely believed that most warnings were written for the weakest person in the room, and that she was not that person. Friends said that Liam had learned not to argue with her about it directly. However, the guide that evening, a man named Jacob, who had run night drives in this conservancy for 11 years, had not yet learned to read her. Jacob had announced over the radio at 8:40 p.m. that 2 other guides in the area had tracked a male lion moving through the central drainage corridor earlier that evening. Lions are Africa's apex terrestrial predator. Adult males can reach 420 pounds and nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, built entirely around explosive short-distance speed and the mechanics of bringing down large animals. They are not incidental dangers. A lion that feels cornered, surprised at close range, or provoked in low light will charge with very little warning beyond subtle posture, changes most tourists do not recognize quickly enough. When the vehicle stopped at a water point and Jacob instructed everyone to remain seated, Danai asked him if he always treated adults like they were children. Liam said nothing. The engine idled. Jacob said politely, addressing everyone, that lions can kill people. Then he said it again, looking at Danai specifically. She told Liam that Jacob was being dramatic. As the lion shifted closer through the drainage line, the brush parting silently ahead of him, Jacob raised his voice again, warning that the animal was watching the vehicle and to stay still. Witnesses later said the lion had lifted his head higher and fixed directly on the movement coming from Danai's side of the vehicle. Danai was still inside the vehicle, but had partially opened the door and stepped 1 foot onto the running board in order to steady her filming angle. The phone held out and angled back at her face in shaky low light, laughing, tracking toward the brush line, while Jacob immediately shouted at her to get back inside and reached across the seat toward the open door. When the lion charged, he did not vocalize. He covered the distance in several bounding strides. He simply moved, and then he was on her. The lion struck high, colliding into her upper body as she tried to pull backward through the half-open door. One paw hit across her chest and shoulder hard enough to spin her sideways off the running board, while the animal's weight carried both of them into the buffalo thorn beside the track. Witnesses described hearing the brush crack first, followed immediately by Danai, screaming once before the lion clamped onto the upper part of her torso near the neck and shoulder area. Liam ran toward her almost immediately and was struck aside by a glancing paw swipe that knocked him flat into the dirt. By the time Jacob and the other passengers began shouting and advancing toward the lion from the vehicle, the animal had already retreated back toward the brush line. Liam got up. Danai did not. A vehicle from a neighboring guide unit made the emergency call. Danai was loaded and airborne an hour later. She died from her injuries before they reached the clinic. After the attack, Liam returned to Johannesburg alone and eventually left his job and sold their shared apartment. The real tragedy isn't that she thought the world was bigger than her comfort zone. It's that she never understood why some boundaries exist to keep the wild from becoming a wound. Our next Karen story is about snacks and a grudge against a camp cook. Check out what animal will resolve this. It was August 14th, 2017, on the southwestern fringe of the Serengeti. For Selena Marrow, the day began with an argument about camp rules and a sun that hadn't yet finished setting. She had no idea that the real cost was still days away. Selena Marrow had built a small following by reviewing restaurants across Southeast Asia and coastal Australia through short, contemptuous videos on YouTube. A travel outlet had commissioned her for a piece on safari camp food, the gap between what operators advertised and what actually arrived on the plate. She had called the pitch Safari Theater. She flew into Arusha on August 11th and reached the camp by land on the 13th. By the evening of her first full day, it looked like the Karen in her was already coming in hot. She had argued twice with the camp manager, once about dinner service timing, once about the prohibition on personal food inside tents. She considered the policy performative. That night she brought 3 protein bars, dried mango, and a sealed container of mixed nuts into her tent. In a message sent to a friend at 6:42 p.m., she described it as a small act of protest. Staff had repositioned and relatched all food storage bins that afternoon. 2 separate guests had reported lion tracks in the dry watercourse before sunset. Lions are not common immediately adjacent to tented camps in this corridor, but they are not unknown. A male lion averages 400 pounds, a female 280. Their canine teeth apply over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. They can tear through heavy canvas with a single claw hook. The camp also sat along a known game trail used by migrating wildebeest and zebra during dry periods, which occasionally brought predators closer to human structures after dark. The senior guide, Festus, who had worked that corridor for 9 years, conducted a walkthrough of the tent row at roughly 5:15 p.m. and spoke to at least 2 guests about keeping tent flaps fully sealed and zipped. He did not speak to Selena. Her tent light was on when he passed, but he was immediately shooed away when she heard him walking closer. Footage from a camp exterior camera showed a single female lion entering the camp perimeter from the dry watercourse side at 6:51 p.m. Her movement was slow and cautious, stopping multiple times to look toward nearby tents and listen. She moved low, shoulders rolling, head extended, and was nearly silent. Investigators later believed the lion had likely been following scent trails from improperly discarded cooking scraps near the staff preparation area earlier that evening, and Selena's occupied tent was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The lion lingered around the outer edge of camp for several minutes before approaching Selena's tent. The first contact is audible before it is visible, a heavy inhalation, then the sudden rip of canvas as a claw hooked through the tent wall just above Selena's sleeping pad. She shouted twice, sharp and rising. She opened the inner flap outward, and immediately the lion's head filled the opening. What followed is partially captured on 2 separate recordings and took under 2 minutes. Selena was pulled forward, her shoulder wedging against the tent frame. The lion appeared startled once Selena began screaming, but continued swiping and biting during the confusion at the tent entrance. She was bitten a minimum of 4 times, the right forearm, the left hand, a deep raking bite across her ribs. But the 5th bite, a sustained clamp to the lateral neck, severed her right carotid artery. Other guests began throwing boots, water bottles, and a folding camp chair. Festus arrived with a flare gun at approximately the 90-second mark and discharged it twice skyward. The lion flinched, but did not immediately release. The lion dragged her another 3 feet before the second flare caused it to back away. Selena remained on the ground. Medical staff arrived 25 minutes later and found no vital signs. Her funeral was a sparse affair in her hometown of Perth, attended by a few bewildered relatives. Selena's death wasn't a tragedy of wilderness. It was a tragedy of performance, where the real lion wasn't the one with teeth, but the one she'd been trying to starve in herself all along. And speaking of performances, another performative Karen coming up. It was August 14th, 2017, on the eastern boundary of Etosha National Park, Namibia. You might think a person who podcasts about service failures would read a room or a savanna. Lorraine Pask was 45, a consumer advocacy podcaster from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her format was simple. She traveled, documented failures in hospitality, escalated complaints to management, secured refunds or upgrades on camera, and monetized the footage. I already hate this. She had done it with airlines, cruise lines, boutique hotels, and rental car companies. The safari was her self-described super episode, a 10-day Namibia-Botswana trip meant to fill an entire season of content. She had already filed complaints about thread count, generator noise, and breakfast temperature, and kept pushing to dine alone in total darkness with no staff or guests visible on camera. Officially, she claimed it was for audio quality. In reality, a posthumously published note from her producer revealed she planned to expose the lodge by proving its wilderness dining experience was staged and safe so she could demand the trip be refunded. She'd built her career around manufactured outrage, but even by her standards, I think it's vicious. The surrounding bush that evening was dry scrub, low acacia, and open sand, exactly the habitat spotted hyenas exploit after dark. They are not scavengers that stumble onto meals. They are among the most successful large predators in Africa, with jaws capable of generating over 1,000 pounds per square inch of force, enough to crack the femur of a giraffe. A single adult weighs between 90 and 190 pounds. Their approach is often silent and cautious, relying on opportunity rather than immediate confrontation. Lodge staff had logged 3 hyena sightings within 400 meters of the perimeter fence in the 6 days prior to the 14th, and the security briefing conducted that afternoon for all guests explicitly referenced elevated activity. A laminated advisory card had been placed in every room, and Lorraine likely saw it too. She was sitting at a table positioned roughly 30 feet beyond the perimeter, lighting inside a low visibility extension of the dining deck approved only for escorted use. She scoffs when the ranger offers an escort during the safety speech, like the very suggestion is an insult to her intelligence. She said that she has a reservation, and she knows how to walk to a deck. The second time, at 7:42, a staff member dares to approach her table again. Same offer, same waste of her time. She doesn't even lift her head from her phone, just flicks a hand sideways, as if shooing a fly. I think that the gesture says everything. At 8:11 p.m., lodge cameras captured movement near the tree line about 60 feet away, followed by a second shape 2 minutes later. She didn't react. At 8:14, she looked into the darkness, likely assuming it was staff. By then, the hyena had slipped through the brush to within roughly 15 feet. When she stood, it charged from cover and slammed into her midsection, knocking her backward hard enough for nearby guests to hear her scream and the chair scrape violently across the stone patio. The animal clamps onto her left flank and upper thigh area and pulls violently while she tries to brace herself against the overturned table. The force drags her partially across the stone deck before she falls fully onto her side. Staff behind the secured perimeter activated floodlights and air horns within seconds. The hyena immediately disengaged under the sudden lighting and acoustic deterrents and retreated into the brush without re-engagement. 2 lodge employees and an armed ranger reached her within seconds of the hyena retreating. She was still conscious and trying to speak, but severe wounds to her abdomen and upper thigh caused rapid blood loss. Staff pressed towels and table linens against the injuries while applying pressure bandages from a trauma kit as the ranger covered the tree line with his rifle. They dragged her back inside the secured light perimeter, but witnesses said she quickly became unresponsive and died before the evacuation vehicle arrived. Staff later reported the same hyena had become habituated to food waste around several lodges that dry season. This might sound mean, but dismissing armed rangers who knew the land better than your ego doesn't make you a savvy consumer advocate. It makes you a walking liability, and getting yourself killed on camera was the only refund you truly earned. The next Karen's motivation wasn't content, wasn't a refund, wasn't a point to prove. It was trying to make 2 kids like her. It was March 14th, 2015, at a working ostrich farm on the R328 outside Outshorn in the Western Cape. Vanessa had been married less than a year, trying to build a family that didn't quite want her yet, and she was losing an argument she didn't even know she was having. Vanessa Greer was 34, a secondary school administrator from Bristol, who had married Dale Greer 11 months earlier. The South Africa trip had been her idea, including a last-minute stop at an ostrich farm she booked after seeing a brochure at their guest house. Dale's children, Liam, 11, and Priya, 9, showed little interest, and as the trip grew tense, Vanessa kept pushing harder for everyone to enjoy it. Ostriches in the main enclosure, 7 adults, ranged between 220 and 280 pounds and stood close to 8 feet tall. They have forward-facing kicks powered by legs capable of delivering over 2,000 pounds of force per strike, with a single claw on each foot capable of causing severe and potentially fatal trauma to large animals, and that include us humans. You have to understand that they are not domesticated, they are managed. The guide, a farm employee named Joe, warned the group to stay behind the rope line and avoid approaching or feeding the ostriches through the fence. Vanessa interrupted twice to complain that the rules seemed excessive compared to the close-up photos advertised online. A German family on the tour later said Joe repeated the warning after Vanessa had already stepped past the rope once for a photo and laughed off the correction as overdramatic for birds. Dale quietly pulled her back, and from then on, Joe kept a closer watch on her. The German teenager had been filming parts of the tour on his phone, capturing what happened next. At the third paddock, Vanessa moved to the rope line while the group was clustered near Joe, who was discussing feeding behavior. One adult bird, later identified by farm staff as a female, had separated from the group near the far fence and was moving parallel to the rope line at a slow walk. Vanessa stepped over the rope. Joe immediately raised his voice and stepped forward to order her back, but she was already raising her phone and had crossed fully into the buffer zone. Witnesses said that she justified just taking a picture in an irritated tone before waving Joe off with one hand. Witnesses saw the bird stop walking. It turned its head. Its wings, each spanning close to 6 feet, shifted outward from its body in a distinct posture that farm staff later described as a standard threat display. People heard Joe shouting. The bird covered the remaining 12 feet in under 2 seconds. The first kick connected with her upper chest and left shoulder, and she went down sideways onto the clay. The second kick came as she was falling, striking her lower abdomen before she fully hit the ground. She did not get up. The bird stepped forward and kicked again into her side as she lay on the ground. Dale crossed the rope line and reached her, and the bird turned and kicked him once across the left forearm and hip before Joe drove it back using a long-handled distraction pole. Liam and Priya were still behind the rope. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later from a clinic on the main road. Vanessa was conscious but unresponsive to questions. She was airlifted to a hospital. Dale was treated on site for a fractured forearm and bruised hip and was discharged that evening. However, Vanessa died at 11:52 p.m. from blunt force internal injuries. The flight back was quiet, filled with administrative tasks, canceling the safari leg, arranging leave from work, and explaining to an 11-year-old why his stepmother wasn't coming home. Honestly, the tragedy was less the bird's violence and more the fact that even in her final moments, she was still arguing alone. The next one had no reason, just another argument a Karen was determined to win. It was March 14, 2018, at a private conservancy in southern Kenya. Janelle had earned this trip, 2 years of planning, a private vehicle, a premium experience she had paid for in full, but the Savannah doesn't accept receipts. Janelle Whitcomb was 41, an American expatriate based in Dubai. The Kenya safari had been 2 years in the planning. Positioned in her mind as a personal milestone, she had earned according to her few friends that tolerated her. She had budgeted for a premium conservancy experience, hired a private vehicle and guide, and arrived with 2 camera bodies, a telephoto lens, and a phone permanently raised at eye level. I think what made Janelle's presence difficult was not impatience alone, but a consistent pattern of overriding professional instruction. Her guide, Osei, a licensed tracker with 11 years of field experience, had logged her behavior twice before the third morning. The day prior, at a lion sighting, she opened the unlatched vehicle door before he had finished assessing wind direction. That evening, during a buffalo approach, she stood upright in the open roof hatch after being told to sit. He spoke to her firmly, both times. She said he was being overcautious, and that she had done this before. Osei had seen fresh leopard signs along the drainage ditch that morning, pug marks, a half-eaten impala, the musky scent of a predator holding territory. Most safari guests do not treat leopards with enough distance. Adults average 80 to 200 pounds, with forelimbs and shoulders built to pull down larger prey. A leopard in this context is typically defensive, not predatory toward vehicles, but will escalate rapidly if cornered or approach too closely at a kill. Osei stopped the vehicle about 40 yards back. A large male was visible at the ditch's edge, half hidden by scrub, crouched over the kill but already alert, head lifting, ears flattening. Through the open roof hatch, Osei told Janelle to remain seated and keep movement minimal. Twice she ordered him to move closer, stressing that she paid him to obey. He declined. The drainage cut behind the animal limited its retreat, he explained, so any pressure would be read as a threat. She told him this was exactly what she had paid to see, and that he was managing the experience for himself, not for her. During a brief moment when Osei shifted the vehicle forward slightly to improve distance and angle without leaving the cabin, Janelle pushed open the rear side door, which had not yet been secured after the stop, and stepped out. She moved approximately 15 feet from the vehicle toward the ditch edge, before Osei's voice from inside the vehicle becomes sharp and direct as he notices her through the side mirror and turns his attention fully toward her movement. The leopard, which had been stationary, registered her movement and pivoted from the edge of cover rather than open ground, committing once the perceived distance collapse became immediate. It did not hesitate. The charge from its position to contact covered roughly 20 feet in under 2 seconds. The impact knocked her backward and to the left into the low scrub bordering the ditch. She did not fall cleanly. Her right leg caught on a root cluster, and she went down at an angle, partially inverted. The animal made contact a second time while she was grounded, its jaws closing on her lower abdomen before Osei's shout caused it to release and spring back into cover. Osei secured the brake, grabbed the mounted radio, and exited only after confirming the leopard had withdrawn into vegetation, then ran to retrieve a medical kit. The leopard withdrew further into the drainage brush. Janelle was conscious when Osei reached her. She had 2 injuries, a claw rake to the right hip and upper thigh, and a bite to the lower abdomen. The abdominal wound was critical. Osei applied direct pressure with a field kit and radioed the Conservancy Patrol immediately. She died from blood loss approximately 30 to 40 minutes later during evacuation coordination before the aircraft arrived in the field. The guide followed every correct protocol. The warnings were given, repeated, and documented. I think what is genuinely difficult about this case is not the animal's behavior. Leopards do exactly what leopards do. It is the fact that the word no from a trained professional had become, somewhere along the way, just an opening position. Still, what happens to the next Karen is worse, because the guide couldn't even get close to her. It was August 14th, 2014, on the Victoria Nile inside Murchison Falls National Park, Uganda, where the river flattens into wide channels between shifting sandbar shelves, and the afternoon had gone quiet, in the way the guides knew better than the tourists ever would. Elise Hartman was 36, a freelance regulatory consultant from Hamburg who had built a professional identity around identifying institutional failures. She traveled frequently, documented everything, and had a reputation among colleagues for pushing back against authority when she believed protocol was being applied arbitrarily. She had booked a 5-day safari through a licensed Kampala-based operator, the Nile stretch being the second day. Her stated goal, mentioned to at least 2 other passengers the night before at the lodge, was specifically to witness the crocodile behavior in the wild, not in a sanctuary. The Nile crocodile, adults regularly reaching up to 16 feet and exceeding 2,000 pounds in large dominant specimens, does not chase. It holds still in shallow water near exposed shoreline, often fully submerged except for the eyes, and waits for something to enter the strike zone. And of course, you already know their signature death roll. That August was peak nesting season, and females had been confirmed within 200 meters of the primary boat channel for 2 consecutive weeks prior. The guide had received a radio advisory that morning warning all river operators to avoid unscheduled passenger disembarkation along the central sandbar corridor due to confirmed nesting activity. He relayed this to the group at departure. At approximately 2:20 p.m., Elise began complaining of nausea and cramps, demanding the boat stop so she could stand on solid ground. The guide declined, citing the advisory directly, and maintained a strict no disembarkation safety posture in line with park protocol. She escalated. She accused the guide of fabricating the restriction to cut the excursion short. The argument lasted approximately 9 minutes. At 2:31 p.m., Elise stepped off the bow onto the sandbar unassisted while the guide was repositioning and a second crew member was at the rear engine. She landed in approximately 4 inches of water at the bar's edge. She had been standing there no more than a few seconds, roughly 6 to 8 seconds by witness estimation. The crocodile came from her left, out of water that appeared no deeper than her ankles. There was no warning sound. Witnesses described the initial movement as a white spray and a single heavy impact. The animal's jaws closed across her left thigh and lower hip. The force of the strike knocked her sideways and partially into the deeper channel adjacent to the bar. For approximately a brief moment lasting only a few seconds, she remained visible above the waterline, upper body twisted, one arm extended toward the surface. Then the crocodile rolled. A death roll in shallow water generates enough rotational force to cause catastrophic injury. This time, she went under. The guide immediately throttled the engine, shouted warnings, and radioed River Patrol while maneuvering the vessel away from the sandbar edge. The animal did not resurface in that location. The river absorbed visibility rapidly, with strong current and sediment disturbance reducing surface clarity within seconds of the initial strike. A patrol vessel and wildlife unit arrived on site at approximately 30 minutes after contact. Full remains were not recovered. Death ruled accidental, with notation of victim-initiated departure from vessel against direct operator instruction during an active wildlife advisory. Authorities updated river access enforcement protocols within 60 days. No public statement was issued. What makes this case genuinely hard to process isn't that the risk wasn't communicated. It was communicated clearly, professionally, and more than once. Elise made a calculation that her own judgment outweighed the guide's, stepped onto that sandbar to prove a point, and the river settled it in under 10 seconds.